Welcome to Mr. R's art class. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Thumbs, subs, and ring that bell. So same thing that we did for this top drawing here is that we need to draw these first three hands in order to get to this final view here. So we could grab a sheet of paper for each of these hands that could take up maybe half a sheet of paper. They don't have to be the same size as they are on this smaller sheet of paper. You could take up a half sheet of paper. So let's go ahead and get started. So this kind of looks similar to what a grid transfer is. And so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have 5 squares on top of each other. So we could draw that here on this sheet of paper. And we could even maybe draw a longer rectangle and then evenly divide that. Okay, so then we have the top here. Okay, so then we're going to turn this big rectangle here into a smaller grid transfer. So now we need to draw, that's 1 square, 2 squares, 3 squares, 4 squares, and then this bottom part here that's opened up. Okay, so then we could look at this like a grid transfer for this first hand here. So for this first finger, it kind of starts not at the very corner. It starts almost at the corner, and then it goes down and it meets up with the bottom of square number 3. So first square, second square, and the third square. So the bottom left of that third square. So we could just kind of sketch this out real quick. Line up those fingers. You can use a ruler if you want. And then, so that's that top of that finger there. Then we're going to draw on this thumb. This thumb kind of comes outward. It goes outside of this third square. Then we have the bottom of the thumb, which is almost the palm here. Alright, so then we're going to draw that in the fourth square. So it should be in the fourth square. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. This one goes in the same direction. Looks like these are parallel, so they go in the same direction. And then this top wrist, or this top of the hand here, keeps going, continues outside of these squares. And then we need to draw the front wrist here. It looks like it goes almost straight down. All right, so that's the first step. Then we need to draw, in order to draw this hand here, from this side view, we need to draw this first step in this spot. So we're redrawing step number 1, where we're going to draw step number 2. Okay, so again, we need to draw, we could start with a big rectangle if we want. And then create some even squares in here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we can have this empty space down here. And we need to draw step number 1 before we start adding anything extra for step number 2. So we're redrawing step number 1. Redrawing step number 1. So remember we had this top finger here. Kind of matches up. And it's almost close to this corner, but it's not. So it's a little bit to the left of this corner. And then it goes and meets with the bottom corner of square number 3. So 1, 2, 3. It's the bottom left-hand corner. 1, 2, 3, bottom left-hand corner. And we connect those two dots there to draw in this first step. And then it could keep continuing onward. And then we need to draw the top of our thumb, or where our thumb is going to be. And then the bottom of our palm here. In the same direction, so those two lines are parallel. And then this wrist goes straight down. Okay, so step number 1 is redrawn here for step number 2. Now we need to draw any extra details here that we have for step number 2. So we already drew these steps or step number 1 here for step number 2. Now we need to add anything extra. So notice that these lines are not telling you that this is a thumb here. These lines are telling you where the thumb's at. That top line is telling you where the thumb is at, the middle of that thumb is at, and then this bottom parallel line is telling you where the wrist starts. So maybe we could start with the wrist here, or the palm here. And then this line here is telling you where the middle of your thumb is going to be. And the top of this thumb will kind of match up with the top of your third square. Come back down. So the middle of this thumb should be where this line's at here, where we drew this line. Curves back, and then we have the palm. So this line goes through your thumb. This line should be going through the middle of your thumb. Then we could come up here and draw the fingers. So these fingers are actually inside of these squares, right? So that thumb was outside of the squares. And so where this finger, where this index finger is, where this index finger is here, is going to be hitting the right side of this line that we drew diagonally for step number 1. Okay, but it's important to notice that this finger doesn't follow that same line. So this line that we drew is for the back of the hand. So this index finger isn't following that same line. So those two lines should not overlap. So this is going to be what I'm drawing, the top of the index finger. So it's not following that same line there. So then this index finger curves at the top. Hits the side there, those squares. And then before we get to the bottom second square, it comes in a bit and goes back out to the thumb. Okay, then we would draw in the middle finger here. And again, this middle finger, that line that goes through the middle finger is this line here. So the middle finger isn't following that same path, that's just telling you where that finger would be. Comes up. Okay. So for step number 3 here, we need to draw these first 2 steps in the same area where we're going to draw step number 3. So we need to draw these first 2 steps in this area for step number 3. Then we're going to come back and draw those extra details that step number 3 actually has. So we need to draw step number 1 first, one more time. So we need to draw a big rectangle and then divide that big rectangle into 5 squares. So you could draw this a lot lighter than what I'm drawing, or how I'm drawing it. So we're going to draw this into 5 squares. So 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5. And we need to draw this step here for step number 1, even though this is step number 3. Okay, so this finger is almost at this corner, but it's not, so we're going to go a little bit to the left of that. Then at the bottom of square number 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. That's where the back of the hand actually goes outside of these squares. So we could connect those 2 marks that we made, And then it goes a little bit further, and then the angle changes slightly. Okay, then we could draw these lines here that tell us where the thumb is at. So this line here tells you where the thumb is at. This line doesn't tell you where the top of the thumb or the bottom of the thumb is at. It just tells you where the thumb will be, or where the middle of the thumb will be. So this line here that goes diagonal isn't actually in square number 3. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, and 3. So it goes out here to that direction. Then we have this other line here that goes parallel, and in the same direction, but it starts at the bottom of square number 4. Bottom of square number 4, but goes in that same direction, and that line is telling you where the bottom of the thumb or the palm starts. And then we have this line that connects to that. That's where our wrist begins. Okay, so this is all the steps here in step number 1. These are all the steps here in step number 1. So now we need to add these steps here that we have in number 2. Okay, so we can start with the palm here. So this tells you where this palm starts, and we should be outside of the squares at this point, and it kind of curves up. And then we have this thumb that kind of starts out from this corner here. So it starts out from this corner, but we're out of the squares. So that's where the thumb starts. And then this bottom of the thumb could kind of connect with that curve there for the palm. And then we pass through. This thumb kind of is curved a bit, so we pass through this line that goes in that direction. And this thumb actually comes up into the second square. Comes back down, and starts going into these squares here. And then comes back down to almost hit where that line's at. Okay. So then we can start with these fingers. This index finger is actually lined up. This index finger here is actually lined up with these squares here, right? But the back of this index finger, the top, no matter how you look at it, is not lined up with this line that we have here. So this line is not the top of our index finger. It's just telling you where those fingers are going to go. Okay, so we could start from where our thumb's at, and then the bottom of our index finger is actually kind of lined up and actually might even come out a little bit from these squares, but not too much. And then the top of our index finger actually does hit this line here, but it doesn't follow that path. It's not on top of that same path. It could go in the same direction, but it's not on top of that same path. And then this line here for this index finger will stop right at the bottom of square number 2. So that's for the index finger. Then we have where the middle finger starts, right over here. So it starts on top of the index finger, kind of comes out a bit of these squares, comes back down, and it kind of follows that same path of this line here, but it stops just below square number 1. Just below square number 1 because it meets up with the index finger. But then it comes back out for the back of the hand. So we could erase that line. So where it meets up with this diagonal line, that's when this starts following, this wrist. So we have the index finger, we have the middle finger, and then you would start adding these extra details here for step number 3. So we have step number 1 drawn in, we drew step number 2 over that step, and then we're going to go ahead and start adding these extra details for step number 3. So these first 3 steps, they're kind of just sketches for our final finger here. So we would just kind of sketch this out. We would even clean this up. We would start cleaning this up for step number 3. But then for step number 4 here, we would redraw these previous steps in this spot here, but we would clean it up for the final step. So we would get rid of all these lines here for step number 4. So let's kind of finish up what step number 3 would look like. I'm going to draw in the thumbnail. And you could start cleaning this up or tightening up some of these lines here. So where this bend is, that's where you see this line. And this thumb actually tightens up here a little bit too. It doesn't follow that same path that we started out with. And then they start sketching out where this thumb meets the palm. This palm actually tightens up a bit. So we would clean that up for step number 4. So all these sketch marks, you could kind of leave them here, but for step number 4, that's where we start cleaning a lot of this stuff up. Okay, we can add where this wrist comes in, or the bottom. Then where this bend is, that tells us where this first curve is for our fingers. Then we could evenly space out these other lines here where our fingers bend. So where these other joints are for our fingers. And then for the middle finger, they're a little bit offset. So where these fingers bend here, for our index finger, they're not lined up with the middle finger. They're offset just a little bit. These joints here are a little bit higher than these joints here for the index finger. And you would just see the back of these knuckles though. You would draw these fingernails in for the middle finger. And then same for the index finger. Okay, so this is what step number 3 would look like. So you're almost done. You just need to do step number 4, and step number 4 is you doing these first 3 steps, so step 1, 2, and 3 in this spot here. Then you would clean up all these areas here. So if we had step number 3 here, because we're ready to add number 4 details, we would have step number 3 here. We would start cleaning up some of these lines that we have for the thumb. We would get rid of this grid, and we would get rid of any diagonal lines, vertical lines, or horizontal lines that we do not need for step number 4. So step number 4 should look something like this. It should look pretty similar to what step number 3 looks like, but a lot more cleaned up. So if you have any questions, go ahead and let me know. Thank you for watching the video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. And feel free to watch any of the other related videos.